here we are. We have got a small map to orientate ourselves. And although we did not pre-organize our three talks about the ancient Greek and Roman worlds, actually there's going to be quite a lot that come together here from the first talk where we were thinking about there are great individuals, human individuals in myths, coming then to think that we need those myths. I want to stand before you and say, yes, we need those myths, but in them, the human individuals in the ancient Greek and Roman world were generally rubbish. So this is the example that we're going to be working through with you today. The ancient Greek world, the wider ancient Greek world that encompassed the whole of the Mediterranean, Magna Graecia, was a patchwork quilt of over 1,000 different city-states, all doing things in different ways with their own rules, regulations, philosophies, ideas, political systems, etc. There were, within that mix, a lot of foundation stories of how mother cities set up what we call, slightly problematically now, their colonies, particularly out into southern Italy and Sicily, and our interest today in North Africa, where the colony of Cyrene was founded in 631 BCE. The stories that are told about these foundations change over time, and there are often multiple stories circulating about how one particular place was founded. Now, why need those multiple stories, or why encourage those multiple stories? Actually, it constantly reflects several different dynamics that are going on within the wider Greek world, and particularly between the mother city and the colony. The first is the power and importance of the mother city. Whether that grows or diminishes over time, its role in the colonial foundation grows or diminishes. The power and independence of the founded settlement, the colony itself. Again, does it want to always be seen quite as subservient to its mother city or surpassing it? The role of the gods, as we've heard, the development of different philosophies and ideas, and of course also the role of individuals. And more widely, the more general relationship between what we might call central Greece, mainland Greece, and this wider Magna Graecia world, as that changed over the 1,000 years or so we might call of the archaic and classical period of the ancient Greek world. So let's turn to Cyrene as our particular example. Founded, as I said, in 631. Now, in Cyrene itself, which was excavated by Italian archaeologists in the agora, the marketplace, the key central part of the ancient settlement, from at least the early 6th century, so 575 BC onwards, there is a monumental tomb, which many have interpreted as the tomb of the founder, the individual, a guy called Battus, who was crucial, as we shall see, to this foundation story. You might say, hang on, Michael, you're talking about human beings as rubbish, and yet we're starting here from the point where the city itself seems to monumentalize architecturally an individual who made their community possible. But we don't have to go very far into just the early 5th century BCE before a different kind of narrative begins to emerge. In Pindar, who wrote many victory odes for Cyrenaean victors in the Olympic and Pythian Delphic games, we see a different story emerging, one in which Cyrene was actually an eternal part of the wider Greek world, the wider Greek cosmos, because it was the site of Apollo's marriage to a nymph, helpfully called Cyrene, and actually Cyrenean earth was transported way, way, way back in time, back to a place called Thearan, the modern island of Santorini, where generations and generations later, this Battus would emerge. We have a different narrative in which actually the individual is almost irrelevant in the longue durée idea that the gods were always in Cyrene. During the course of the first half of the 5th century, back in the agora of Cyrene, the tomb of Battus is architecturally completely ignored. It is not at all a focus for what the community decide to build, elaborate, and monumentalize. Indeed, in the second half of the 5th century, it's completely paved over. And a new tomb is then put on top of it in a rather contemporary fashion, at very much the edge of the agora, not seemingly a central person to the narrative. And in the last quarter of the 5th century BCE, we get the historian Herodotus, who offers us famously two competing narratives told about the foundation of Cyrene, one by the Cyreneans and one by the Thearans. So the Thearan version goes like this. The king of Thera went to the oracle at Delphi, the oracle of Delphi, of course, belonging to the god Apollo. We're back with Apollo again. He went on completely other matters. But every time he tried to ask a question, all the oracle said to him was, go and found a city in Libya. The king said he was too old, and he pointed to somebody random in his retinue, who turned out to be Battus, as the person who should do it. But no one got on and did it. And as a result, Thera was beset with 7 years of drought, until someone said, you know what, maybe we've done something wrong here. They went back to the oracle of Delphi, and the oracle said, well, you haven't done what I said you should do. The Thearans went, well, it's quite difficult because we don't actually know where Libya is. Maybe somebody on Crete does. So they sent some people to Crete to find somebody who might know where Libya is, found them, grabbed them, set off on a ship, got to the coast of Libya, left this poor Cretan guy there, went back to Thera, and eventually came back with a small community of people, including this guy Battus. Hopefully you're starting to see why humans are not the heroes of my particular narrative of founding myths here. Now, what do the Cyrenaeans say differently? Well, they say, sure, Battus was involved. He was Cretan on his mum's side, Thearan on his father's side, but it was him, not the king of Thera, who went to Delphi, actually asking about the fact he had a stutter. And again, the oracle of Apollo at Delphi said to him, go to Libya and found a colony. He said, oh no, I don't really want to do that. The oracle just kept repeating her command. He didn't go. Still, you'd think he'd have got the message, wouldn't you? But the Thearans suffered so badly as a result that they returned to the oracle, who simply repeated, Battus, you need to get off, and found a colony in Libya. They set off. They got about halfway, and they turned back to Thera again, not at all interested in making the full journey. The Thearans, so desperate to please the oracle at Delphi, pelted their ships with stone so that they couldn't land back on Thera, and forced them to turn around again to go all the way back, this time to Libya, to actually do the job of founding a colony, which they did by colonizing an island just off the coast. That didn't work very well. 2 years later, they went all the way back to Delphi to say, did we do it right? And the oracle went, no, back again. You've got to go on to the mainland, people. They went to the mainland. They set up a colony. 6 years later, it's down to the local Libyans to actually show them the site of Cyrene that should be the proper place where they will found a great settlement. Hopefully, you're really seeing now the picture that the Cyrenaeans told themselves, at least according to Herodotus, about how rubbish Battus really was, alongside all his fellow Thearans. And this is reinforced as we get into the 4th century BCE within Cyrene itself. In 375, they put up a big public inscription, which is known as the Stele of the Founders, in which the Cyrenaeans recount that the original pact of those Thearan founders all stems from the fact that the Delphic oracle of her own accord ordered the foundation of the city. They begin to place in their own written record the foundation of their city not in the hands of humans, but absolutely, completely, and utterly in the hands of the oracle of Apollo, and thus of Apollo himself. And in the second half of the 4th century BCE, alongside this, Battus's tomb in the Agora that had been rebuilt will finally be given a small little bit of monumentalization, but actually still remains a relatively unimportant part of the Agora space. Then in the late 4th century BCE, the Cyrenaeans will put up a new sacred law in which they simply say this: Apollo issued an oracle, the Cyrenaeans shall inhabit Libya forever. And by the mid-3rd century BCE, that tomb of Battus in the Agora would actually be completely upstaged by a beautiful monument erected by one of the Hellenistic kings that looks a little bit like this thing, that was put absolutely right in front of it, obscuring it from view. So the picture I'd like to offer you is this: that in the story of the foundation of Cyrene, supposedly from 631 BC, but in those stories that are told about how the foundation happened over time, all the way through to what we know as the Hellenistic period in the 4th and 3rd centuries, and then indeed we could trace it even further on into Cyrene's Roman era life. There is a progressive move to change the emphasis, to push the emphasis away from individuals as having agency or original responsibility, or indeed in some ways any relative importance in the foundation story. There is no calculated risk-taking and deliberative action that describes our Machiavellian leader here in these ancient narratives of foundation. The humans are at best puppets, and not particularly great puppets at that. Why do this? Because actually what it does for the Cyrenean community is place their foundation, their story, back into time immemorial, into the world of the gods, and thus gives it a certainty and a surety within an ever-changing, wider Mediterranean world that hopefully provides them some kind of reassurance and bolster as they fight for their own survival within that changing world. So the moral of the story for me is this, and I would like to leave you with, that gods and their oracles make far better leaders in founding myths than humans ever can, because they are the ones who can ensure ultimate survival and relevance of a particular community. And as a result, really minimalizing human leadership is the way forward.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Is this story of Cyrene unusual among the hundreds of Greek policies that were established?
It is unusual in the sense that we have quite so much detail of the different versions that are narrated of it over time. And it's famously thrown up as an example in which Herodotus is being that tricksy historian that Herodotus is in offering competing versions of the past to the reader or to the listener to say it's up to you to decide what happened in history. I'm just giving you the two different competing versions that are out there. But it is not unusual in the sense that over time, narratives changed of foundations between mother cities and colonies. Sometimes they went in the opposite direction to the Cyrene story. Sometimes they got much closer. And actually, suddenly people, it wasn't an individual that was completely thrown out of the way. Actually, they were brought even more central to the story. Sometimes the two locations were physically joined in the geography of the world. So we see lots of different examples, but definitely the changing nature of these stories is omnipresent.
It seems as if Cyrene is more than just marble and stone. It has a kind of soul in this narrative.
I think it does. I mean, here, it is one of the most extraordinary colonies sitting there in North Africa of the Greek colonies, and one that proved very important back to mainland Greece. We could overlie these stories of changing founding narratives with the political story of Cyrene's constitution. So it has periods of democracy, it has periods of monarchy. At what point do those different political systems make the community itself want to be closer or further away from some of the mainland Greek cities and other communities that it could be linked to? So for instance, when Cyrene is a democracy, there's a notable desire for it to be seen as more like Athens, and when it's not. But at the same time, Cyrene was an absolute key economic part of the wider Mediterranean world. It was, in many ways, a breadbasket. And we have surviving evidence from Athens that when they are in a kind of a part and parcel of a famine in the 4th century, it's Cyrene that is sending in the grain to actually supply and help life in mainland Greece continue.
But this story that was unknown to the audience 15 minutes ago, does this show that our concept of ancient Greek history has been very much limited to present-day Greece? And we have been taught very little what happened in Asia, in Africa, in Sicily and so on.
I think those parts of the picture do need to be put back in because they were considered fundamentally part of that wider Greek world. And the dialogue between, if you like, the periphery and the center is a crucial part of what makes up the dialogue of the ancient Greek world. And within that, I would like to suggest there's a place, an example that the ancient Greek world offers us in which we don't need human leaders at all to do the things that we hold most dear.